Welcome, everyone. My name is, let's start with our session first. Welcome, everyone, to the Friday Lunch and Learn session entitled Phase 2, Now What? Interpreting and Utilizing Phase 2 Reports. My name is Mark Greger, and I'll be your monitor today for this session. For those of you that don't know me, I am a Brownfield Specialist with Labella Associates in Rochester, New York. I'm also a CCLR Advisory Board member, and prior to joining Labella, I was with the City of Rochester for a little over 30 years, working in brownfield cleanup and redevelopment. In addition to hearing from me, you're going to hear from three other speakers today. Joe McGrath is a planner with Seneca County, and he's CEO of the Finger Lakes Regional Land Bank. Mike Pellicciati is a senior environmental geologist at Labella Associates and a colleague of mine. And Amy Fisk is the Brownfield Program Manager for the Niagara County Department of Economic Development. And she's also the president of the Niagara County Brownfield Development Corporation. So you've got a good panel of people to talk about how to use Phase 2 reports and how to deal with them, frankly. After hearing from our speakers, we should have some time at the end for questions and discussion. So let's get started. For many of us in the brownfield that practice brownfield work, Phase 2s are often where things get complex. And in order to set the stage for our discussion today, I think it's important to acknowledge that when it comes to evaluating Phase 2 reports, sort of where you stand depends on where you sit. And by that, I mean, what perspective do you take on the results of Phase 2 reporting depend on the role that you serve. So, some examples would be, are you a property owner? Are you a seller? Are you a buyer, a lender, a developer, a risk manager, a legal advisor or counsel, a regulatory agency, or a local government official? And today, I think we're going to somewhat take the perspective of those of us that have been in local government or are in local government and working in that capacity, or a community entity that's interested in advancing the redevelopment of a vacant or underutilized site. That's often the challenge that's faced by local government in particular. So I think from that perspective, we're going to first hear from Mike and Joe. Mike and Joe both worked together on a project for the Finger Lakes Regional Land Bank. I think that case study will be a little bit of the focus of what they will go over. And with that, I think we'll transfer things over to Mike and Joe for a bit.
All right. Let me share my screen here, Mark. Thank you. All right, can everybody see hopefully everybody can see the screen. What I'm going to discuss is just an introduction and overview of Phase 2 environmental site assessments. Then I will discuss how to plan and some of the challenges regarding Phase 2 environmental site assessments. And then Mark and I will kind of discuss the property they worked on together recently with the Finger Lakes Land Bank. If anybody does not know, a Phase 2 is typically driven by the outcome of a Phase 1 environmental site assessment or other similar type of environmental site assessments, such as transaction screens. The Phase 1 is only intended to identify what is called a recognized environmental condition, which represents the presence or likely presence of hazardous substance or petroleum products to be present at a property. Some of the components that kind of go into a Phase 1, if anybody doesn't know, we typically look at a database search at the New York State DEC records, municipal records, review sandboard maps, street directories, looking for sites such as dry cleaners or gas stations. You look at aerial photos that could represent filling at a property, and there's another component that includes a site inspection and interview with the site owner and operator. The phase 2 is ultimately intended to confirm the presence or absence of contamination at the site.
Michael?
Yes.
We're not in a slideshow view for the slideshow.
You're not. You can't see my screen?
We can see your screen, but we can see the entire PowerPoint program with the
There we go.
There we go.
There we go. Sorry about that. So this getting back, a phase 2 is intended to confirm the presence or absence of environmental concern that's identified in a phase 1. Those can be such as a former use of the property as a gas station, dry cleaner, or other potential use of concern. Usually involves sampling soil, groundwater, or other media for contaminants of concern. And typically, as I mentioned before, these are basically mostly driven based on the historic use of the site. If most people who need phase 2 ESAs are typically someone who's looking to obtain financing for a bank. Generally risk driven, as contamination at the site can affect the value of the property. And sometimes municipalities may perform phase 2 ESAs to help market a foreclosed property for potential buyers and developers. Typical costs of phase 2s run around $5,000, but the cost can increase significantly based on the size of the property and the amount of environmental concerns that were identified in the phase 1 site assessment. When we get the phase 1 report, we typically go through the planning process to design a sampling plan to address the potential areas of concern at a site. Usually the phase 2 uses some basic principles, but when you generally write up a report, there is some significant judgment that can go into the report. The phase 2 will need to address all the environmental concerns identified in the phase 1 ESA. For example, gas stations testing would not be performed only in the underground tank areas. Testing would also be completed at pump islands as well. And if the gas station had hydraulic lifts for auto repair, we would test those areas as well. The phase 2s typically always focus on the areas most likely to exhibit contamination, such as a hazardous waste storage area. We would typically only test in that area only. We wouldn't conduct testing in other areas of the site. It's not intended to delineate the extent of contamination. Typical types of samples that we collect and analyze part of a phase 2 would include soil, groundwater, or soil vapor. These types of samples will be targeted based on the contaminants of concern at the site. And also, we would determine the type of equipment to be used for the phase 2. The scoping of phase 2, the proposed sampling areas are reviewed and the type of equipment is selected. Some sites have restricted access and require specialty drilling equipment that is used indoors or can fit through doorways. For areas where there is suspected landfilling or dumping, you would typically scope test pitting, as it allows the analyst who's doing the field work and sampling to more clearly define the fill material, as opposed to drilling and observing soil cores, which allows you a lesser perspective. Some of the challenges of performing a phase 2 is, whether decide whether you want a robust scope of work versus a minimal one. A robust phase 2 will include a lot of sampling. However, depending on the concern that is being investigated, a minimal scope may only be necessary. Some purchasers have experiences with gas station who may want a more robust phase 2 to fully understand, what type of contamination is left at the site. They may want this information to use if they have to upgrade any equipment, what kind of costs would be involved in handling contaminated soil at the property, even if it was less than the standards or slightly above. Some lenders have their own required phase 2 ESA scope of work. Some have their own, staff that reviews phase 2s, and they can recommend additional testing for the property as well in order for the buyer to obtain the loan. A phase 2 typically a phase 2 does not quantify the amount of contamination. This sometimes can be a little bit frustrating with the outcomes of some phase 2s if impacts are found, but as I mentioned before, phase 2s are generally just intended to assess areas of suspect contamination. Sometimes you're able to get enough information to establish a ballpark cost estimate for remediation, but typically they're not designed for that. Interpreting a phase 2 report will typically, you'll summarize the work performed, what type of equipment was used, such as a drill rig or, hand sampling. We would list the testing results and compare them to the applicable standards for soil and groundwater, to show whether they exceed or are beneath cleanup levels. And there's a conclusion and recommendation section, and which would typically involve, what was the outcome and the findings of the phase 2 and what would be the next steps for the site, if any. The report ultimately needs to answer the question whether contamination exists above the levels or there's a safety concern that poses potential risk to any site users. The phase 2 report conclusions and recommendations section may include a significant professional judgment when interpreting results and the conclusion recommendations. We worked on sites where if there's a lot of contamination that's significantly above the levels, it's usually usually it's a little more clear recommendation what the next steps are. When there's little to no contamination at or above the standards, sometimes there's more thought and additional work may be recommended. We recently completed a phase 2 at a former industrial site and identified trichloroethylene at low levels in the soil above applicable standards. During the testing, we did not observe groundwater in the borings, in which we typically like to test at industrial sites, as the water table was not present above the bedrock, which was about 15 feet below the ground surface. The industrial site was vacant for several years, and some of the areas were not accessible due to dilapidated buildings that were condemned. We recommended additional testing and installation of bedrock monitoring wells and further soil testing. As a result, we did find a localized area of impacts, which is why sometimes these reviewing the results of initial phase 2 is very important, and they can vary from site to site. There's no standard phase 2 for each site. Each one has to be addressed to the concern you're investigating. Ultimately, the phase 2 will help lender and a buyer make a business decision, whether they want to purchase the site or not. Now I'm going to talk about the case study that I worked with Joe McGrath with the land bank on. Joe retained us to complete a phase 1 in November of 2019 at a property in Waterloo that they acquired, and the building was recently demolished. As part of the phase one, we identified an adjacent dry cleaner. If you can see the figure, it's right next to the property to the north. The dry cleaner operated at the site for several years, and it was identified as a concern. As part of the planning stage, we began to test the most likely areas of contamination, which was the northern property line adjacent to the dry cleaner. We included soil borings to collect soil samples and groundwater samples from the property line. We tested for the typical dry cleaning chemical tetrachloroethylene, or sometimes referred to as PERC, and we found levels in the soil and groundwater at the site above applicable standards. In the phase two, we recommended further testing should be conducted to delineate the extent of soil and groundwater impacts at the site. After discussions with the land bank, in order to make this property maybe more marketable for a developer, we suggested conducting some additional work just to define the extent of groundwater and soil impacts at the property. This discussion with Joe was this information would be helpful to understand what costs would be involved if someone were to purchase this property and to develop it, as there would be some additional costs as far as handling and disposal of contaminated soil and groundwater, whether a soil slab vent system would be needed for a new building, and other considerations. And at this point, I'm going to go on to the next slide. If anybody has any questions, and Joe can talk about this project from his perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. So this is the view of the bowling alley prior to demolition. This project was one of the first things that I was tasked with tackling when I came to Seneca County, which was my first professional job after grad school. So I kind of got thrown right in the mix on this one. So I am notoriously bad at taking before and after pictures, so I had to pull this one off of Google Street View. So this is a little bit better condition than what it was when we tore it down. So the facade on the front of this bowling alley was crumbling into the street. It was a hazard for pedestrians and people parking their cars. Next door to your left, that is the dry cleaner property. It first was a dry cleaner, was converted to a dry cleaner in the 1920s, and was a dry cleaner up until about a year before we tore the building down. I think we can move to the next slide. So these are just some pictures of the project in process. It was, quote unquote, an emergency demolition. So as soon as we acquired the property, we went right for demo. So these are just some pictures. That's typically what it looked like inside. The roof was collapsing. I had a better picture with a tree growing up through one portion of it, but I couldn't find it. And then there's some pictures of demolition in progress and the flat or close to flat site at the end of that process. So the way that it worked was after we completed the demolition and the site was physically safe, we kind of took our breath and said, well, I guess now we got to do a phase one, which is, I understand typically not how you should do things, but here we are. So we completed the phase one, and they identified the dry cleaner to the north, and that we should do some more testing. So I think we can go to the next slide. So Yes. They discovered as part of that phase 2 that there was PERC, or the dry cleaning chemical, or I'm not even going to try to say the chemical word. We took that information back to, my colleagues at Seneca County and the Village of Waterloo, and there wasn't much experience with brownfield or environmentally challenged properties within our working group there. So the demolition project that we had recently completed got pretty complicated and got pretty hairy. Through the course of it, we identified and had to abate or remove vermiculite fill that was under the bowling alley, which increased our costs more than double what we were expecting to put into that demolition project. So everyone was a little bit wary of, what if we have this phase 2 and everybody's saying that we need to have more testing conducted to try to get the property back to beneficial use or back on the tax rolls. What does that more testing buy us? What do we get for that further effort? So I think we can go to the next slide. What do we do now? We didn't want to keep throwing money in the hole with no end game. Our board and the other stakeholders at the county and the land bank were concerned about that. We have a grant from the Local Initiative Support Corporation that funded a large portion of the bowling alley demolition, and they were aware of our trials and tribulations throughout. And they organized a webinar with CCLR or CCLR. And after that webinar, I contacted basically the people on this call directly to hopefully get some further guidance and some technical support. Next slide. So we had a couple of conference calls in the spring. And we were able to reevaluate our expectations and our view of the property at the land bank and county level. So with Gene and Mark's guidance specifically, we were able to go back and say, these problems aren't going to be fixed tomorrow. They may not even be fixed in the next day. And that we need to, set our expectations for this might be a long slog of trying to redevelop this property. With leaning on that technical support, Mark and Labella came up with a scope of work for further environmental testing that would delineate the extent and the severity of the contamination throughout the bowling alley property. And it's my understanding that with that more robust testing, we'll be able to combine that with an RFP for project development. And it was mentioned to us in the course of one of the conference calls that you're almost better off finding more than less, because it can be more attractive for a developer to utilize existing brownfield programs. So, with that rough plan and the expectation setting with the stakeholders at the county, that what we were able to do with CCLR's support kind of calmed everybody's nerves about the project. We're still waiting for some properties to close in the land bank to fund the further testing. We're a pretty small operation, so we got to wait for the dominoes to fall to pay for things. So that should happen shortly, and we're looking forward to getting the results back and putting them together with the village for an RFP. What we're really looking to see there, and what the village really would like to see in there from their development plans, is some sort of mixed-use building that has sufficient space for a small grocery store. In the village, there are no grocery store. So we're trying to solve that at this site. And I think that's all the time I have. So let's believe Mark is next or Amy.
I think it will be me. Thank you, Mike and Joe. I think you've set the stage really nicely for what I hope will be, the next couple of presentations here. And we'll sort of go up to a higher level, I think, first, and then drop back to practical responses that Amy will provide. So let's see. Time to share my screen. Hopefully we can get that going. I'm not seeing my presentation here. Let's see. Not a video file. Oh, you had it up. Okay. Okay. I'm hoping everybody can see the presentation. The next steps here, I'm going to try to go through pretty quickly. From an overview standpoint, the next phase, and it's kind of the step that Joe went through, is how to develop an action plan that follows the phase two, that's site specific and site focused and strategic. And then what are some of the steps that you typically would need to go through to respond to that? So it's kind of the situation again that Joe found himself in. So you've got a phase two with you. You've reviewed it with your environmental consultant, and have an understanding of the conditions that were found. It's sort of what do you do next? And from my experience, 4 key things that we need to spend some time immediately beginning to look at are site access and control. And using the example that Joe talked about, site access, there was on-site access, but then there's the question of source area access and control for the adjoining property that was contributing the PERC contamination. And then of course, immediately related to that is addressing data and information gaps. In this particular instance, Mike and I did work to try to put together a proposal and got that over to Joe to begin to address those additional data needs. Cost estimating is another important consideration here. We're probably a little bit premature in the case study that we just heard for cost estimating, but it is very common, and I did already see one question come through that cost estimating, or at least preliminary cost estimating, begins to be a question and something that consultants are asked to do at the stage of phase two or shortly thereafter. And I always kind of indicate that liability and risk management really now begins now that there's been issues identified, recognized environmental concerns, conditions that have been verified, and contamination that's been verified. So jumping off from that, the initial site considerations that affect time, money, and uncertainty, and as a result, risk, I've sort of listed several here that typically I would look at as a property manager for municipality or as somebody interested in acquiring property. Are contaminants above applicable standards? We'll talk about that a little bit more later. The nature and extent of contamination, is that determined? In other words, how big are the problems? Are there immediate concerns, public health issues, or reporting requirements that are that need to be responded to as a result of the conditions that were found? Also, very much related to practically managing sites, are there regulated building materials such as asbestos present? There may be geotechnical issues that you begin to have some information about as a result of the phase two work. And what Joe kind of alluded to was, is the contaminants that are the contaminants that are present at levels that would actually create BEAST Brownfield Cleanup Program in New York State eligibility? So in other words, do you have enough contaminants to potentially get into the Brownfield Cleanup Program, and then how can you leverage that? The same issue applies to EPA grant eligibility. And This is often the stage where people and organizations that are evaluating properties begin to get a little scared about, what direction they're going. So can they walk away? Should they walk away? In many cases, municipalities are the owners of last resort, so they can't walk away. Initial project organization, and you heard some of this from Joe. There needs to be a project leader, which apparently is Joe in this case. There has to be organizational support, maybe a board. In municipalities, it's often a team, a legal team, environmental, real estate, engineering, could be others. There needs to be a really practical discussion of site objectives and desired end uses, because now that environmental conditions are going to begin to influence desired end uses, or at least the costs to achieve them, that has to be a very frank and upfront discussion. And then stakeholder identification at this point becomes important, because you're going to have some existing partnerships, but now you're going to have neighbors and adjacent property owners, maybe community groups, and you may be running into adversarial and non-responsive property owners and parties, which challenge the project, and you have to plan for that. From an action planning standpoint, I've got a couple of slides here that are very summary, but there's a bit of a deep dive for each of these. Access control and ownership needs to be thought through from initial site investigation, which, in the case of the Finger Lakes Land Bank, it's under their control, through preparation of an RFP, if it's a municipality or an entity like the Land Bank trying to promote redevelopment. How does site access control and ownership change or flow through the process of RFP, cleanup, and redevelopment? And that needs to be thought through. Legal liability and risk management, this may seem obvious, but there are tools such as environmental insurance and formation of LLCs and things like that that can be used to manage liability and even transfer liability through purchase and sale agreements and terms and conditions of those agreements. The New York State DEC and EPA, the timing of if and when to involve those agencies is, something that needs to be thought about at the stage where you begin to have results from a phase 2. It may be possible to do a project without involving those agencies. It may be that in order to make the project viable, as in the case of a site where there's contamination and BCP eligibility, it may be that the state brownfield tax credits are what's necessary to make the project viable. And then you have to, if that's the case, then you have to think about the timing and the phasing of work, and then who does what. So additional assistance and partnerships is getting at how you get funding. Do you need support through the regional economic development councils and other federal and state agencies? So finally, we begin to get to what you might have heard of in earlier sessions this week about resource roadmaps and the plan for your project, and this is sort of taking phase 2 all the way to redevelopment and reuse. It's important to evaluate the approaches for additional testing and cleanup and property transfer, and think about those through the entire phase of the project. Project roles and responsibilities and communications, who's going to do what, when, and then down a little bit further, you see who pays for what and when, and those things need to be planned out, and that's part of what this action planning is about. And it usually takes somebody who's got some experience with these types of projects. And then finally, you need a schedule, and you've got to put your sequencing in the right order and have the right timing. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up and try to get Amy plugged into the next phase here, and have Amy sort of go back and do the deep dive about what's necessary to make this work from local government standpoint. Amy? I think you're muted, Amy.
Of course, everyone, there's a lot going on in my office, so I muted everything so that way no one could hear what was going on in the background. Well, great. Thanks so much, Mark. I know we're, getting down there on the session, so I'm going to try to go through things quickly. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. You have it up there. I think it's there, hopefully. Okay, so I'm Amy Fisk. I'm the Brownfields Program Manager with Niagara County, and we've been at this Brownfield thing for a long time. And, I have to say kudos to Mark. He's been my Brownfields hero for years. And, I think that's the big thing. Find someone who knows what they're doing in Brownfields and bounce ideas off of them. And, don't reinvent the wheel, and lean on your colleagues out there, because there's a lot of people who know a lot about brownfields, and hopefully a little bit more about brownfields after this awesome conference. So with so many phase 2 reports, what do you do? In Niagara County, we've done 52 phase 2s over the last 20 years through EPA's Brownfields program. And the sites, it's, you have all these reports, and some of them, they just sit on the shelves. And where do you start? Because you have so many properties, and it can get overwhelming. And so it's trying to figure out what to do with these reports. And I've noticed that over the years, our approach has definitely changed and evolved. And I've learned a lot. At the very beginning, it was like, what do I do with a phase 1? How do I even read it? How do I understand all the technical terms? And, it's figuring out what to do with these properties and where to go next. So a phase 2, really, you're still at the beginning of your brownfields process. It's really just telling you that you have some issues. It's giving you some data on those issues, but you really have a long way before you get to the redevelopment. So it's certainly that development deal with a pretty complex twist in it when you have to deal with all the environmental issues associated with it. So what we like to do in our phase 2s, and I know this was a question, I was trying to keep tabs on the questions that were being asked so I could hopefully integrate them into my presentation, because I don't know how much time we're going to have for actual questions. But one of the things I saw in there was about action plans. And as my phase 2 process has evolved over the years, consultants probably don't like me as much anymore, because I'm asking for more and more every time I send out these RFPs. But I really am focused now on like a solid next steps action plan section. I'm a planner. I like to have next steps, and I like to have preliminary cost estimates associated with those. And our reports now, our phase 2s, I'm asking for ballpark cost estimates per task. So if soil remediation is needed in a portion of the property, how much approximately is that going to cost to get it to industrial levels, commercial levels, or even residential levels, depending upon what my anticipated reuse is. And I want timelines, and I want sources of where can I get the money from? Is it, this might be a great BCP candidate, and the tax credits would be worthwhile for a developer to come in, or this property has a lot of contamination. It's not something the private sector is going to touch. It's not financially viable. So you need to look at other avenues for remediating this site. And so I really have focused on that as the plans evolved, because I know some of my earlier phase 2s, I would get the report and I'm like, okay, well, all this is great, but what does it mean that I have high levels of PCBs and metals and VOCs? How much does that cost to clean up? I have no idea. And so really relying on the experts in getting that information and making that like another section of my reports past the conclusion section has really helped me figure out what to do with these properties and where to go next. And also the conceptual planning stuff, the BOA program and the DRI program, they weren't around, 20 years ago when we started doing these phase 2s. And so we really didn't have that solid community engagement piece. And I think that's when we were just doing phase 2s that maybe the municipality thought was important, but there really wasn't like residents or citizens or even the development community behind these sites. They would just say, well, we have this corner gas station that's ugly, do an assessment on it for us. And then those reports would kind of just sit because we didn't know what to do with them. But now having the community engaged, I think has really changed our phase 2 process and where we're targeting our phase 2s. And we're trying to blend those into the BOA and DRI sites, because those are already community priority sites. So one of the things that I like to do, because we have so many sites and we have very limited money, I try to categorize all of my properties. So if it has a high development potential, is it something we can market to developers that, they can take care of on their own? Is it something that is a great candidate for the BCP or even the environmental restoration program, which unfortunately is not funded right now, but hopefully that is on the horizon to get refunded. That was a program for municipalities to help assist with cleanup and assessment costs. Or is this a property that may be really important to the public or nonprofit sector, and that we can get them grants to clean up the property? Or is this one of our, oh no, please don't touch the site? So it's a state or federal Superfund program site. I try to tease that out based upon the contamination that's there. I talk to DEC a lot. All of our phase 2s have gone through the EPA program. And those, tend to have more robust scopes of work. So, we get a better handle on what the extent of contamination is by using the EPA Brownfields program. And some properties, honestly, they don't qualify for the state or federal Superfund programs, but their contamination is just to the point where it's not something that, we can tackle right now. They are not the low-hanging fruit. And so they just sit in my black hole. We try to make sure that the sites are secured and that there's not an imminent public health or environmental threat. Obviously that would probably qualify for a Superfund program, but we let them sit, honestly, because we have so many properties in Niagara County that are contaminated, and we just don't have the resources to be able to tackle every single property. And this categorization helps us figure out, what to do with the sites and really elevate some of them to development. And we've tried to think of different reuses, and obviously that's going to drive what your cleanup costs are going to be. But we're looking at more of some of the non-traditional uses, and we're really focusing on solar as a good reuse for some of our brownfields and our landfill sites, because what else are they going to be used for oftentimes? And so, that's something that is helping us in our land use decisions. So gaining phase 2 proficiency, I think this might be my last slide. Really, if you're at the beginning of your career, or if you're just starting to do phase 2s, talk. There is no stupid question. I feel like the only stupid question is the one that's not asked. Because if you think, oh, this is simple, well, someone else was in that position at one point in their career, and they're like, oh, I don't want to ask that question because it seems too simple. But that's how you learn. And conferences like this, EPA roundtable meetings, CCLR has been amazing. I've been relying on them a lot lately for elevating some of my properties, getting them out to the market to developers, and creating fact sheets and the roadmaps. So they've been amazing. DEC regional staff in Region 9 is where I'm at, and they've been great. Big shout out to Jen Doherty. She was with Region 9. I know she was in a session earlier this week, and she was talking about the agreements that land banks and municipalities have in regards to liability. We just got one of those. Jen was instrumental in helping me get that done, so I appreciate that. Ask questions to environmental consultants. They're here to help you. I've asked so many questions, and there's some amazing consultants out there that have really helped me. In conversations with colleagues, like I said, Mark's been amazing. I've asked him so many questions over the years, and he's taught me a lot. When in doubt, Google it. The internet's an amazing thing. You can find lots of stuff on the internet. Here's my contact information. I'm happy to help anybody, interpret their reports, or, if you bounce ideas, we're always here. One of the things that came up, hopefully I can go back into the presentation. Not sure where I went here. So one of the things that I was looking at the chat. So, somebody had asked about scope of work and the RFPs. So one of the things that I did early on was I would write my own scope of work, and I would send that out to consulting firms, and I would have them bid on that scope. And I found out that is not the way to do it. I am not an expert. I mean, I have a background in geology and in planning, but I'm not the expert at this stuff. So what I've done for the last several years, and it's worked out much better, is I've sent out the phase 1, and I've asked the consultants to give me a scope of work based upon that phase 1, and I've got much better product. And it has been interesting early on. I had to create all these tables for myself. I'm like a organizational crazy person, I guess. So I had to have everything like organized and color coded, and, to make sure that I was comparing apples to apples. And that's the only danger I would throw out there, is that when you're doing that, you should make sure that, you're comparing proposals fairly and evenly, and you have to look for number of samples and stuff like that. So, and then I just saw, Mark, are we going to have everybody come back up and do questions?
Yeah, it's been great, Amy. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I do want to tell everybody that you are absolutely one of those expert resources from a local government perspective that they should lean on, because we all leaned on each other, and that's how you make progress. So that's a good message. I want to thank you for addressing some of the questions as they were popping up, Amy. And I think you already picked up a couple of those. Did you see another one there that you wanted to tackle?
Yeah, one of the things, and definitely, Mark, I'm sure you and maybe Joe and Mike know a little bit more about too, but the issue of emerging contaminants, we have been struggling with that one a little bit. And so the sampling is so expensive, I'm finding, for emerging contaminants. And so I have been including it in some of my phase 2s recently, but only on properties where I think there's a very high likelihood that they're going to advance to the Brownfields cleanup program, because I think DEC is requiring it now. And I'm trying to position some of my properties so that they'll be taken over and put through the BCP. Or we had a couple of properties that were fire training facilities, and I knew, I knew issues. So we went ahead and did the sampling. And one of the questions about more robust phase 2s, I've tended to do more robust ones, just because I want to try to gather as much information early as possible, because we want to try to move these properties. And I think if we give developers enough information so they can see that the site would be eligible for the BCP, that tends to work out better. We've also done, I think almost every phase 2 I have like the GPR surveys on there, just because we find tanks all over the place. And then one thing, and I think it's probably more unique to Niagara County, is we have a lot of radiological issues. So pretty much every phase 2 I've done, I want to say in the past 5 or 6 years, we've done radiological screenings on, because it keeps popping up everywhere, and it pops up, at the worst times, it seems.
Mike, on the emerging contaminant issue, I know at Labella we've got a whole task force on PFAS and other emerging contaminants. What's been your experience in terms of including emerging contaminants in phase 2 investigations, and getting that work done? I know it's expensive, and I know that sometimes it can be tough to even get the data back in a timely manner.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. And Amy's right. It is fairly expensive to sample. I don't think we're at the point yet where for every phase 2 we would recommend PFAS sampling. We would, typically do what Amy, I think is looking at, just do some PFAS sampling where there's a suspect of PFAS contamination. I know some local attorneys I've talked to are kind of wondering if we get to the point where PFAS sampling will be a lot more common as we go forward during our phase 2s. But right now, just to sum it up, we pretty much will just do it when we anticipate there is a concern.
Okay. One thing, Joe, that I wanted to toss out to you. You're a little bit newer to all this, and from the standpoint of services from a consultant, I'm sure you were listening to Amy about how she's loaded on scope to consultants, and but I'm interested in your perspective about what consultants can do to be maybe a little more responsive, or to help anticipate what your needs are. I think we had a nice follow-up when Gene made the connection, Gene Hammerman, and made the connection with me and Mike. But I'm interested in your perspective as someone newer to the field. What you think might be more helpful, and whether there should be scope included earlier, or whether there needs to be an educational component to some of what we do. Just curious about your perspective.
Sure. Well, I want to thank Amy. I took very good notes while you were speaking, and I may be reaching out to you offline in the future for some advice. So I was thinking about consultants and at least in my own political environment, based on what Amy was saying, that you want to get the best bang for your buck. And not only with this project, but other things we've done with the land bank and the planning department in Seneca County. It's always harder to go back and ask for more of what seems like the same thing to your boards. Even if it is a little bit different, but if you can get into the scope the most that you can at the beginning, and get that paid for and out of the way, at least in my perspective, you're going to be in better shape down the road. And as far as the bowling alley site itself, we had the phase 2 done, and alarm bells went off here at the county, and it took us a little bit to get connected with you, Mark, through, even though we were in with Labella already, we had to go around the long way through CCLR to find you. I think, I'm getting a sense for how big Labella is now, but I did not have one then. And I think there's, competing firms that are a similar size. And I don't know if there's siloing. I know it happens in every organization, the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. But, if you know that there's somebody sitting in a position in an organization that you're dealing with, you got to do everything you can to make sure that people are there. And I know that Mike was instrumental in helping us and doing that and interpreting, what's here and what our options are. But it took like a slightly different, more planning perspective than a science perspective that was important. And I'm glad that we did get around to finding it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Joe. And it's one that I used to, I guess, criticize consultants with when I was on the other side. And that is, how come your environmental people don't talk to your structural engineers who don't talk to your architects who don't talk to your utility people? And the answer to that is we do, but you're right. There are some silos and organizational structures that sort of need to get beaten down a little bit. And it's interesting that you went, you sort of had to go outside to CCLR to get back to me at Labella. So that's a point well taken. What we did have a couple of other questions that one was related to the timing of approaching EPA with grant proposals and approaching DEC, and can you do both at the same time? And sort of what are the considerations in doing that? And I know, Amy, you've probably had to think through that. Do I go to the BCP program or the spills program before I go to EPA and get my grant dollars? Mm-hmm. I know that in general, when I was at the city of Rochester, we would try to determine our EPA grant probability of success pretty early on. But then from that point on, it kind of depended on a site-by-site basis whether we jumped to a BCP program or engaged DEC otherwise, and or applied for the grant with the same timing. So any thoughts on that, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, we've typically done the EPA grant first, and we've been very, very fortunate, in getting EPA Brownfield grants. So oftentimes what will happen is we'll assess the site and then we'll see, I'll categorize them at what silo they're going to go into. And if it looks like it's a BCP site, then, we'll start pushing that angle and trying to get a private developer to take it through the BCP. And we've done a few BCP sites as a municipality. It was great when we had the ERP program, because then you could match the state and EPA money, and it was perfect. This is a big plug out to anybody from the state that's on this session, please refund that program. Like with a lot of money, I got, probably about 40 sites ready to go.
Another question that I guess could go to anybody here, and maybe we start with you, Amy. It was regarding assessing a site for a private owner and how to sort of mitigate their fears about dealing with assessment grant requirements, the sort of public nature of some of this information, and not take and fears or hesitancy to take investigations far enough down the line, maybe to answer questions because of worries about what you might find and how that might, create problems as a result of finding contamination.
That has been probably one of our biggest struggles. A number of years ago, I created a consent to access the properties form that I make the private property owners fill out. And we have a mix of properties. So sometimes we'll have private entities come to us and say, we're looking at buying this property, but we don't want to do it unless we have an assessment. We don't want to pay for the assessment and invest in it, and it's a community priority. So we'll do those and then it's no issue. And then we have other properties that we tried to get on and the owners will not let us. And, they're maybe a key property in our BOA or DRI areas, and we just haven't been able to tackle that. We do have a lot of tax delinquent properties, and now with the agreement with DEC, we're really moving forward pretty rapidly on trying to get control of those properties, so that way we can assess them because we have site control. But I think that's a huge issue, and the education for private property owners, it's a real issue. Okay.
Mike, there was an early question that came in from the audience regarding ASTM E3033, which is beneficial use of landfills and contaminated sites. I don't have any direct experience with that, but I was wondering, Mike, have you bumped into that? And I suppose, Amy, you may have as well, given that you're up in Niagara County where there's all kinds of interesting things going on. Mike? You're muted, Mike.
Actually, no, I have not run into that at all. Most of our phase twos are done to the ASTM standard, which does allow you, there's a lot of leeway to make your own professional judgment how that is conducted.
Okay. How about you, Amy?
I don't really have any experience with that. I mean, everything we've done is just to the ASTM standard. So. Okay.
We're getting close to our extended allotted time. I guess while I still have everybody, first I want to thank all of you. This has been a really nice discussion. Amy, Joe, and Mike, really appreciate your involvement, and it's been great working with all of you over the past few years that I've had the pleasure to do so. I also want to point out that for people who may have not gotten their questions answered, or that want to contact us, that they can continue to do so through the platform FeedLoop, with through chat or through the networking function. But I know I'll be putting my PowerPoint presentation up, and that'll be part of the proceedings, and people can reach out to us. Obviously, I think that's the case for everybody else on the panel. So I did want to mention that. Any last thought from you guys that any message that you want to convey to our audience? Maybe Joe, because you're the one who, you're freshest to all of this, and maybe you've got a question for us that, we can still help you with.
I have no thoughts, but yeah, we're going to be pushing ahead here as soon as we can to do the next phase of extended or further environmental testing, and see if we can't get this site into some sort of program and get it into privately held hands as well. That's a big deal for us for the tax base. So yeah, I really appreciate the help that Mark and Mike and the rest of the staff at CCLR has given us thus far. But it's not over. So We're expecting to see more of you.
Yeah. And don't hesitate to bother Amy. She's got a lot of answers. I think she can help you.
Oh yeah, I've got notes here. We'll be in touch.
No problem.
Okay. With that, I think we're pretty much done. I want to thank everybody. Remind everyone that there is a 1 o'clock session, and I want to check the name on that. A place at the table, driving equitable redevelopment through community engagement, which is very much related to the discussion that we just had. And with that, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of the virtual summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.